Well, good morning, everyone. Always hard being the first speaker, but I'll do my best to liven things up. But you know, it's the Army, so we do things early, I've found. And the other thing I was noticing this morning, something my mom used to tell me, if you ever want to feel old, go to a college campus. I was reminded of that as I looked out the window this morning. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Rob, thank you for that very kind introduction. This is a great event where DARPA partners with Texas A&M University, one of our nation's leading research universities, in an effort to connect with new communities of talent. I understand this is the 5th of 6 events in this DARPA series, and I'm very pleased to be a part of it. So before I talk in a bit more detail about the Army's current efforts, I wanted to say a few points on the importance overall of innovation and technology innovation in national security. Simply put, in my view, America's ability to innovate, the whole country, private and public, especially in the area of technology, is one of our superpowers, frankly, that helped us win the Cold War and will help us outcompete our adversaries today, as long as we take the right approach. Much has been made, especially inside the Beltway of Washington, D.C., about what China's doing in terms of its government-led technology drive. Around Washington, I sometimes hear people lauding China's approach and ability to carefully control vast research and technology development efforts through tight central control and prioritizing funding. Some have even suggested the United States adopt a very similar approach. But I strongly disagree. I believe that our system, free people, free enterprise, and the rule of law will vastly outperform any centralized system over time. As a result, I'm confident that as long as we maintain our focus and work closely with our amazingly innovative private companies, researchers in academia, and technology entrepreneurs, that we will find the technologies we need to stay ahead of our adversaries. So in that context, I'm very pleased to be here today with one of the most innovative parts of the Department of Defense, DARPA, and more importantly with all of you to discuss what we need to do working together to achieve our goals. For more than 60 years, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has made game-changing investments in breakthrough technologies in national security. You're probably familiar with a lot of them now. Precision weapons, stealth technology, unmanned aerial systems, all of which in their different ways change the character of war. This kind of innovation today is more important than ever for the United States Army because we are in the middle of our largest modernization effort in 40 years. To enable this historic modernization effort, we're counting on technology innovation that provides truly revolutionary new capabilities, not just marginal improvements on older technology. As General McConville, the Chief of Staff of the Army, is fond of saying, particularly to me, usually because he's upset about something, we should not be buying new old stuff. Instead, we need to focus our efforts on technologies that break entirely new ground and provide leap-ahead improvements, or new stuff, as the General would say, and he's absolutely correct. As we build this future force, we are keenly focused on the pacing threat of China, the acute threat posed by Russia, as well as persistent threats from North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations. None of those have gone away. China continues to make great investments in artificial intelligence, robotics, and cyber research and development. In addition, China appears to have committed to an increased pace and scope of military exercises, honing its military's joint warfighting capabilities. In its invasion of Ukraine, Russia has brought a level of brutality and destruction to the continent of Europe, tragically on a scale not seen since World War II. That said, we can learn from it. Because it's an ongoing conflict and much of the information is not public, the potential lessons learned from the war are still limited. However, we in the Army have seen a few things so far. First, this is by far the largest drone war, to use a loose term, with both sides using unmanned aircraft of all sizes for a wide variety of battlefield missions. Second, this is also the largest anti-drone war, with both sides, again, using all kinds of technologies from simple to high tech to try to counter their adversaries' unmanned aerial systems. We've even seen drone versus drone aerial combat. I'm sure a lot of you may have seen those videos online, a likely harbinger of something that will become ever more common in the future. Third, we are seeing the effect of the near ubiquity of space-based imagery and other sensors, which enable both sides and the public, as everyone, just go on YouTube and you can see it, to follow events in near real time. Finally, we're seeing what I'd call mass precision warfare, as the wide availability to both sides to use precision attack weapons at great range makes the battlefield increasingly deadly for fixed positions, headquarters, supply dumps, and large weapon platforms. So what does all that mean for the Army? Overall, here's the good news, I am confident the Army's modernization efforts take these new realities into account in many ways as we define capability requirements and develop new concepts. In particular, the Army's current focus on dramatically improving the range of our precision systems, rebuilding and expanding our air and missile defense and drone defense systems, and building vastly more capable communications networks look especially prescient given what we're seeing in Ukraine. The Secretary of the Army, who will speak later today, has recently provided guidance that distills and refines our priorities in order to prepare the Army for the threats we see in Ukraine, but at a far higher level of sophistication and scale in the future. Achieving those goals, each of which has many complex technical problems embedded in them, is where organizations like DARPA and all of you come in. While the Army has many outstanding scientists working in our research centers, we need to harness a far wider circle of groups, both in the government and private sector, to achieve the Army's goals. It's therefore vital that we in the Army work to cast a wider net than we may be used to in order to find solutions to these challenges. With that in mind, let me walk through in a bit more detail about some specific challenges we're facing and where we need your help. One area is definitely the area of autonomous systems, both in the air and on the ground. And in saying that, I want to differentiate between autonomous systems and simply unmanned systems, which we have in great numbers today. As I'm sure many in this audience know, most of our current unmanned systems require data links for control and operation. Links that are both vulnerable to a sophisticated enemy and extremely burdensome on our communication networks to maintain, especially at large scale. As a result, the smarter our unmanned systems are, the more they can do on their own without direct human control, the less vulnerable they will be to the enemy and the less demand they will put on our networks. There is, of course, a huge amount of research in the private sector in this area, which we certainly want to leverage, but there's also some very military unique aspects of this challenge that DoD and organizations like DARPA will likely have to sponsor and work with the services to get to fruition in a timely manner. A second area we need help is dramatically reducing the energy demand of our weapon systems and our platforms, and concurrently dramatically increasing our ability to generate energy in the field. We've gone to war in the past with extremely large and frankly vulnerable supply lines. It's an American way of war, is war through logistics. It's one of our greatest strengths. But in doing so, we do create a vulnerability that a sophisticated enemy could interdict. So we need less energy demand in the front, and we need more energy capacity produced at the front to dramatically shrink what those supply lines look like. Now, we have near-term efforts underway in today's technology in areas like hybrid electric vehicles, and our overall climate strategy requires aggressive action we're firmly committed to. But in the longer term, we need significant advances in areas like new battery chemistry, much longer lasting materials, and ruggedized solar and wind power generation to really move the dial dramatically, and making Army forces in the field require a lot less energy. Another area of help I want to highlight is what I would call affordable directed energy. Here we are finally seeing, through a lot of research and many years, the long discussed promise of lasers and high-powered microwave systems that can provide meaningful military capability. That's the good news. The challenge now is moving to directed energy systems that have the promise to be affordable at scale to deal with new threats, such as swarms of drones, that are otherwise very costly to handle with more traditional missile and gun air defense systems. We're confronting, though now, having done all this research, we're confronting now the high cost of producing these directed energy systems. That's a significant barrier to overcome as we actually want to field directed energy systems across the Army at scale. So in this case, it's a question of technology refinement versus perhaps pure invention. We've overcome great technical hurdles in directed energy, but we now need innovative technical solutions to refining these technologies so we can affordably produce them at scale. Fourth area I'd mention is what I would call counter-hypersonic technologies. So much has been made of advances in the area of offensive hypersonic weapons. We in the Army are one of the leading services in the department developing our own offensive hypersonic weapon systems. However, matching an enemy missile for missile in this area could prove very costly and still leave our forces vulnerable to enemy systems. So we need help in finding innovative ways to counter hypersonic weapons in an affordable way, and innovative ways that offset an opponent's technology in a way that imposes costs on them is the kind of thing that DARPA has excelled at in the past, and we need that kind of innovation now in the area of counter-hypersonics. So a fifth one I'd mention, just in adding, because I had in a conversation back in the back before this, is actually one thing related to what we're confronting with Ukraine, and that's manufacturing technology for older things even, like artillery systems and artillery shells. So this is an area where we are getting a lot of funding support from Congress. It's very much appreciated to dramatically increase our domestic production of artillery shells and the things that go with it, fuses, charges, and primers, to support Ukraine and replenish our own stocks and those of our allies. However, as we do this, we are confronting a challenge of older technology in our manufacturing base on how these things are actually made. So everything from metal parts to some of the high precision systems and fuses are still made in a very traditional, I would call, way. Our propellants and explosives factories, great Americans work there, and we could not do anything without them, but they are working in sometimes very difficult conditions where they are having to do things by hand that would surprise most Americans. We should be able to automate this stuff and make it more efficient and more scalable and more flexible. This is a key push by my predecessor, some of you may know or have met, Dr. Bruce Jetty, and it's something that the war in Ukraine has brought into very clear focus. So these are some of the areas where we need help, but I'd also like to briefly talk about some things the Army's trying to do to not just find innovative technologies, but also move them from research to production across the so-called Valley of Death. I would say one thing, though, before I talk about tech transitions, it is important to recognize, and I want to assure you I recognize it, that it's vitally important to fund research into things where we actually don't know for sure if the Army needs it. Historically, many critical innovations have come from, to use a very technical term, off-the-wall research that started in one direction and then ended up finding a use for a technology in a completely different way. That's a good thing. So we have to do a better job, we need to do a good job of protecting that kind of research. Now, DARPA does a lot of projects like that. The Army does them, but there's always pressure to fund things that are a little closer to fielding, but in my view, we have to fund both. So I will say something about how we're trying to get better at tech transitions, and then I'd be very happy to take your questions. First, we're reforming internal Army procedures to create transition agreements between researchers and program executive offices to ensure that we have innovative technology has a landing spot, and more importantly, funding in place when it's ready to take it into production. I know that may not sound very exciting to extremely smart scientists and entrepreneurs, but making sure funding in the government is actually in place at the right time is something that we have long struggled with, so progress there is very important. Second, we're trying to make sure we do a better job communicating, and this conference is a part of that, with innovators both inside and outside the government on what the Army needs. All too often, as I've heard from folks on the outside, the Army fails to speak with one clear voice. So it can be very difficult to understand what our true priorities actually are. I can just tell you the Army's a big place. We have lots of people doing great work who have great ideas. So I can see how from the outside it can be very difficult to find that one spot or spots, a few spots, where you can truly find out what's really a priority and what's really likely to get funded if we develop the technology. So we in the Army need to do a better job of coordinating our needs and then communicating them through trusted sources of information so innovation communities can find the answers and know exactly who in the Army to work with. From both a military requirement standpoint, and this is critical, there has to be an actual need for the system to do a useful function in the military. And then the technical research side of how to fund the research and then actually get it into acquisition that my organization does. So in closing, we need the creativity and innovation of DARPA's team working with the Army research and development community and the private sector and academia to ensure our professionals have what they need to do their jobs in the field. Our focus remains on collaboration, cooperation, and unity of effort to ensure our joint warfare fighters are ready to deter adversaries and, if necessary, fight and win in combat. All of our work is done for strengthening our technology superiority as recognizing we're in a global race for technical advantage. So I've greatly enjoyed talking with you this morning, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tabitha Thompson with DARPA Public Affairs. I'm here to facilitate the questions. So the first question we have is, given you are in a room filled with researchers and technologists, how can they prioritize their efforts to support the Army's commitment to modernization and multi-domain force?
So those 5 areas I mentioned are just but a few of the many areas the Army needs help with. So I think one thing to do is just engaging with the great Army folks who work this stuff day to day. So here I'll put in a plug for Army Futures Command, one of my partner organizations. They actually run day to day most Army science and technology research activities. They're located in Austin. They're there for a reason, that we want to take advantage of the great innovation, tech innovation here in Texas and this part of the United States. So I encourage you to reach out to them. They will be happy to help you better understand the Army's science and technology needs. A second group, though, critically important to talk to, is my organization. So my program executive offices. They are the ones, my organizations, who actually take the technologies and develop them into fieldable systems and actually get them into production. So as I mentioned, the Army is a big place, but really talking to folks in the Army, in particular Army Futures Command and my organizations, is the best way to find out what we really need.
Okay, thank you. You talked about this a bit already, but what national security threats do you think require more technical attention?
Okay, so I mentioned a few. I think in particular, if I went through my list of 5, the ones that I think are probably most pressing in there is, first of all, the autonomous systems part. We see a future, and if you talk to, for example, new commander of Army Futures Command, General Rainey, we see a future where there are lots of unmanned systems, lots of systems we want to be autonomous, both on the ground and in the air. I think we're running into a challenge from a networking standpoint about how to do all that without, frankly, jamming ourselves in our communications network. So true autonomy at the edge is probably, I think, looking way down, looking at Army kind of 2040, is something that we absolutely have to get ahead of the curve on now. And then kind of at the other end of the spectrum, but also vitally important, is that manufacturing technology issue I pointed out. Everybody forgets about producing ammunition until there's a conflict. We need much more modern ways to do it. I think if any of you were to go and tour some of our ammunition plants, you would see just how old these processes are. Like I said, we have great Americans working there, but we should find a way to make it safer and more automated. So I think those would be my top 2 for the Army, but there are many, many others.
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder, you can submit your questions using the virtual event platform, either online or in the audience. The first question from the audience, you mentioned not wanting to buy new, old stuff. How does the Army decide when a system needs a replacement versus an upgrade?
So that's a great question. There's a lot that goes into that. I think, so the Army's got 2 terms we use to differentiate our systems. When you hear current Army leadership talk about true legacy systems, that term is something we use for something that we really need to get rid of. We have it in the service, but it's beyond upgradable, and we've got to get rid of it and completely replace it. So that doesn't apply to everything, but it does apply to quite a few things we have right now. The other term you'll hear, though, is importantly enduring systems, which are things that we know we're going to have for a long time, but we have to upgrade to keep up with the threat. So how we make that differentiation is often, honestly, a cost-benefit analysis. Is an older system capable of being upgraded affordably and in a way that it's still useful in combat, or is the cost to do so simply more than buying something new? So often it does come down to funding, how much we can afford to put through our system. But those judgments are usually military ones. I rely on my military partners and senior officers I work with to really make those judgments about what's viable in combat and what's not. So if you were to have conversations with the military about that, I would urge you to reach out to military officers in our different organizations and talk to them.
Great, thank you. What are some of the key technical barriers to closing capabilities gaps?
So barriers is an interesting question. I think challenges is what I would use. I think now I spoke of our system of government and the way we do things, which I still absolutely believe in and think is the best in the world with all its challenges. The way we do funding, I know, is a challenge at times because sometimes technology is ready and the funding's not in place. That's why I was mentioning technology agreements, how important they are. Having watched the department go through these things, I think that's probably the main one, is working with Congress to, where I worked for 19 years, working with Congress to get us a bit more flexibility, to give us more during the year, during a year in between appropriations, so to speak, flexibility to invest in things that are ready. That's an ongoing conversation with Congress. It's part of some reform efforts that are being talked about. As I look at the system, that's probably the main area. It's not lack of innovation. We have amazing innovation across the Department of Defense. We just need, in the government, to be better at getting it moving faster.
Okay. Next question is, how do you get the PEOs to take more risk and adopt breakthrough tech versus just incremental modernization? And for those who are less familiar with the Army structure, if you could describe that role, I think that would be helpful.
Oh, a program executive officer. So most of them are, they're my kind of tactical units, to use an Army term. They're my organizations, ground combat systems, aviation, electronic warfare. They're my organizations that actually do all the work of actually developing and acquiring things. They're usually, the POs themselves are usually two-star military officers or two-star equivalent civilians. We have both. How to get them to take more risk? I think again, the risk calculus honestly comes more from those determining the requirements. My PEOs will absolutely take risks if the requirements community of the Army believes it's worth doing so. That conversation, making sure that that's on me, making sure that my PEOs are tightly integrated with our requirements community, including some of the great folks at Army Futures Command and their cross-functional teams, that is a vital element of getting more risk-taking, which actually I am seeing. We have more programs that non-traditional approaches that are riskier. They won't all work out. That's okay, as long as most of them do. And I think that's the key thing is making sure that it's worth the risk. I think otherwise, you can't ask a PEO to just be the only person in the Army willing to accept that risk. The Army is a big place. We have to coordinate, and we have to have buy-in from the people who are actually going to get the equipment we develop, not just the folks working on developing it. We need both.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the description of the office itself.
Sure.
Can you provide a little detail about those military-specific constraints in artificial intelligence research? And then would you say that those would also be relevant for civilian applications?
So an example of military specificity here is, most civilian systems where autonomous systems that use AI that are worked on, they don't operate in combat. They might have to deal with interference, but they don't have to operate in an environment where someone is actively trying to destroy them. So there's a level of hardening that has to be there in military-specific systems, which I know is a challenge. So that's an example. But I think it is, though, very the basic work being done in the private sector on AI and autonomous systems, we can leverage most of it. There are differences, though, in those edge cases where our systems, for different reasons, have to have different things. To give you another example, in a civilian system, you might have more leeway with size, weight, and power on a platform. But now you bring it to a military context, and someone wants it to be really small, stealthy, and impervious to various forms of jamming. Now you're in a much more challenging engineering environment where going that extra 10% to make it militarily useful is often where we spend a vast amount of our effort and time. But of course, our systems are sometimes different and have to have that.
Of course. When you talk about hardening a system, what are some of the things that you're thinking of from a hardening perspective?
Sure. So both the physical hardening of the system, so being able to operate, for example, in adverse weather. First question I always ask when I'm shown a really cool drone demo is, what's the wind limit? And often there's this awkward pause, and it's not that high a number. So systems that can operate in all weather, for example, autonomous air systems in a broader array of weather. We developed a lot of our unmanned systems in the weather of the Middle East. So not the most challenging in some way. It is in some ways, but not the most challenging area. We need systems that can handle a much broader range of weather conditions. Another one is we have to have systems that can communicate when they need to. As smart as they are, they still have to talk to the humans at some point. We need them to be able to do that in a way that is very difficult to intercept and very difficult to detect and jam. So those data links and comm links often are just as important as actually having the system itself be able to do what it needs to do.
Okay, thank you.
That's two.
Perfect. All right. Many of the priorities you mentioned have broad applications beyond defense. Do you actively engage with the venture community to provide insight into your needs and see if there are opportunities to align private capital with the Department of Defense capability requirements?
So the Army, in particular, does not routinely. However, at the DoD level, so the OSD level, we have one entity right now that does work a great deal. Its main job is working with the private sector, and that's the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU. Their real job is to work with private companies to find out what's actually available, commercial use right now that we can bring into the military. They end up often, though, working with and talking with the venture community who's supporting some of those nascent efforts. There is a broader effort underway. We're working with Congress to get the authorities to establish a Department of Defense venture capital coordination entity to work more with venture capital community to make investments. This is something that's done elsewhere in the government very effectively. With the right leadership and the right authorities, I think it could be quite effective. And doing it at the OSD level is the right level, because that ensures the services aren't stepping on each other and you have one voice with one consolidated set of funding that can kind of do it in a coordinated way. So I'm optimistic about that. The amount of money the Department of Defense can put into venture capital versus the private sector will not be huge, but if targeted wisely, could still make a difference.
Okay. We have time for a couple more questions, so just a reminder, you can submit those via the virtual event platform, either in the audience or online. What Army opportunities are facilitated by Joint Air Force and Navy-oriented research?
So there are many, and it's something we need to be better at, absolutely. So as an example, I don't know, some folks here may have worked in the Pentagon. I could, if I didn't go to lunch on my own, spend all day only talking to Army people, as if no other services exist. It's just how the building's set up and how the services operate. So we do need to be better at this. And there are many areas. So some of those technology areas I mentioned, for example, autonomous air systems, both the Air Force and Navy have great work going on themselves. So we definitely need to be leveraging each other. And this is not that uncommon. I was doing some private sector visits last week on the West Coast and found out about an Air Force effort that is a couple, 3 years ahead of something we were considering starting work on. And I found it out by going and visiting a private company that was doing the work. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would have even known about it. So that's an internal issue for us. My colleagues in the Air Force and Navy, Andrew Hunter, who's the Air Force's, has my job in the Air Force, and Jay Stephanie, the acting Secretary for Acquisition in the Navy. We do need to work better together. And we do here, though, have, and this is Office of Secretary of Defense, Ms. Hsu up at OSD R&E, Dr. LaPlante at Acquisition Sustainment. They often are the ones connecting us across services, and that's absolutely vital. And they've actually got some exciting new efforts underway to do that in a more organized way, so it's not just happening by happenstance. The last thing I'd mention is the Army certainly needs to be, in my view, better tied to what the Marine Corps is doing. They are often, since they're a land force primarily, working on many of the exact same problems. So, and actually, we make a lot of their systems. So the artillery shells issue I mentioned, we make all of the Marine Corps' conventional ammunition, so they would benefit from that as well.
Okay, all right. This is the final question. Are there particular technical disciplines that you believe lack sufficient talent in the pipeline, and how do you think we could encourage more U.S. students to pursue those?
Boy, and the second one, if anybody here actually knows that, I have a 19-year-old I'd like you to talk to. He's my kid. He's studying political science and history. And I'm sure he'll be great at it. But yeah, so on the first one, I think I can tell you that one thing the Army, in our research community, but overall struggles with, is just competition for talent. Secretary Wormuth will talk about this actually in her remarks. How do we leverage that, and how do we get it? So I think one thing we can do is just talk about more about the exciting things we are doing. Sometimes we are our own worst enemy in that. I was at Aberdeen Proving Grounds a few weeks ago at my organization that does electronic warfare and cyber, and they showed me some amazing things they're doing. But it's behind 4 levels of secure walls, and like 3 people know about it. But they had young people working on this amazing new technology. And we need to be better at telling our story about some of the amazing innovative things we're doing to attract people. And that's something that working with, especially the academic community in recruiting talent for the Army, both uniform and civilian, is an area where we need to do a lot better. Particular disciplines, I think ones that we're finding we desperately need are often software related or data management related. And of course also some of the things I mentioned, like AI research and autonomous systems. So those are just some, but we need smart people in these fields across a wide range of technologies the Army researches.
Okay. Thank you, sir, so much for your time.